A man stepped into a street he had walked through countless times before, simply trying to get home that evening. 5 minutes later, he would never leave that street again. At first glance, Russell Gibson's death looked like a simple street murder, but once the case file was opened, nothing made sense. The cameras weren't working. Witnesses couldn't agree on the time. His phone went completely silent just minutes before his death. It was clear that Russell had conflicts with certain people, but it was impossible to tell who hated him enough to cross that line. Even more disturbing was the fact that, in his final weeks, Russell seemed to act as if he knew something was coming. This is not the story of a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but of someone who was slowly isolated, and eventually erased. Russell Gibson was not the kind of man people remembered clearly. He existed in the background of other lives, occupying space without ever fully claiming it. If someone had been asked to describe him, they would struggle to find defining traits. He was average in height, unremarkable in appearance, and careful in the way he moved through the world. Russell learned early on that blending in was safer than standing out. Attention made him uneasy. Silence, on the other hand, felt familiar. He lived alone, not because he actively avoided people, but because relationships demanded an emotional consistency he could never maintain. His mind moved in unpredictable patterns, often circling the same thoughts for days before abruptly abandoning them. Anxiety followed him like a shadow, not always visible, but always present. Some mornings he woke up with a heavy pressure in his chest, unable to explain why. Other days passed without incident, creating the illusion that he was functional, stable, normal. Those days were misleading. Russell's childhood left marks that never fully healed. There was no single traumatic event that could be pointed to, no dramatic incident that explained everything. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of neglect, misunderstanding, and emotional isolation. He learned to internalize discomfort, to dismiss his own reactions as overreactions. Over time, this habit turned inward and became something more corrosive. He questioned his own perceptions constantly, doubting whether his feelings were justified or even real. As an adult, Russell built his life around routine. Routine gave him structure, and structure kept his thoughts from spiraling. He woke up at the same time every morning, ate the same breakfast, and took the same route to work. Deviations made him uncomfortable. Unexpected conversations left him drained. He avoided social gatherings not out of hostility, but exhaustion. The effort required to appear engaged, to respond appropriately, to mask the noise in his head, it all took a toll. Despite this, Russell was not incompetent. He was intelligent, observant, and meticulous when it came to his work. His supervisors described him as reliable but distant. He completed tasks efficiently, followed procedures, and rarely made mistakes. However, there was always a sense that he was emotionally disconnected from his surroundings. He did not participate in office gossip, did not linger after hours, and did not form friendships. To most people, he was simply there, quietly fulfilling his role. What no one saw was the constant internal tension Russell lived with. His thoughts rarely rested. Even in moments of calm, his mind searched for problems, replaying past interactions and imagining future confrontations. He was acutely sensitive to perceived judgment. A glance held too long, a tone slightly altered, these small details could occupy his thoughts for hours. He told himself it was irrational, yet the awareness never stopped the reaction. In recent years, this psychological strain had intensified. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights he lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling as his thoughts raced without direction. Other nights he slept too deeply, waking up disoriented and detached. He began keeping mental notes of his behavior, monitoring himself for signs that something was wrong. This self-surveillance only worsened the problem, creating a feedback loop he could not escape. Russell did not seek help. The idea of explaining his inner world to someone else felt impossible. He feared being misunderstood, dismissed, or labeled. Instead, he normalized his discomfort. He told himself that everyone struggled, that this was simply how adulthood felt. He learned to function through it, even as the weight grew heavier. There were moments when he sensed something was shifting. A subtle change in the atmosphere of his daily life, difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Interactions felt sharper, more charged. The environment around him seemed less forgiving. Russell could not identify a specific cause, but the unease followed him relentlessly. He began to feel watched. Not in a literal sense, but emotionally exposed, as if his vulnerabilities were becoming visible to the wrong people. This growing tension manifested in small behaviors. He double-checked locks more often. He avoided eye contact in public spaces. He altered his walking routes without clear reason. These changes were not conscious decisions but instinctive responses to an internal alarm he could not silence. He told himself he was being paranoid, yet the behavior continued. At work, Russell remained composed. He arrived on time, completed assignments, and kept communication minimal. On the surface, nothing appeared wrong. But beneath that exterior, his mental state was deteriorating. The workplace, once a neutral environment, began to feel hostile. Not overtly dangerous, but emotionally charged. There were people whose presence unsettled him, individuals whose behavior triggered a deep discomfort he could not rationalize. Still, Russell said nothing. He believed that acknowledging the problem would make it real. Silence, he thought, was containment. If he ignored the tension, perhaps it would dissolve on its own. This belief would later prove to be dangerously flawed. As weeks passed, Russell's isolation deepened. He withdrew further into himself, limiting interactions to the bare minimum. The world around him continued as usual, unaware of the slow unraveling taking place beneath the surface. To everyone else, Russell Gibson was just another employee, another passerby, another face in the crowd. No one suspected that his carefully constructed routine was beginning to fracture. And Russell himself, despite sensing the shift, did not yet understand that he was already moving toward something irreversible. Russell's job had never been a source of pride, but for years it had served a single, crucial purpose: stability. It gave him a reason to wake up, a place to be, and a structure that kept his thoughts from collapsing inward. The building itself was unremarkable: rows of identical desks, neutral lighting, walls designed to feel invisible. Russell appreciated that. Environments without personality asked nothing of him. They did not demand emotional engagement or personal investment. He could exist there without being seen. Yet over time, even this controlled space began to feel unsafe. Not because of any explicit threat, but because of a gradual shift in dynamics. Small changes in tone, posture, and behavior accumulated. Certain colleagues lingered too long near his desk. Certain looks carried an intensity that made his skin tighten. Russell could not have explained it logically, and that uncertainty disturbed him more than the feeling itself. He was deeply uncomfortable with emotions that lacked clear causes. Russell responded the way he always had, by retreating inward. He spoke less, avoided shared spaces, and limited his presence to what was strictly required. Lunches were eaten alone, often at his desk or outside the building. Meetings were endured silently. He took notes obsessively, not because the information required it, but because writing grounded him. It gave his restless hands something to do and his mind a temporary anchor. Despite his withdrawal, Russell's performance remained solid. He was thorough, consistent, and precise. Errors were rare. Deadlines were met. This reliability made him difficult to criticize professionally, but it also made him invisible. He was overlooked for advancement, ignored in discussions, and excluded from informal networks. This exclusion did not surprise him, but it reinforced a familiar belief: that he existed on the margins by default. Outside of work, Russell's life was increasingly narrow. His apartment was sparsely furnished, organized with almost obsessive care. Objects were placed deliberately, rarely moved. Disorder unsettled him. He spent evenings in silence, avoiding television and social media. Noise overwhelmed him, especially voices. Instead, he read, paced, or sat motionless for long periods, replaying fragments of conversations that had occurred days earlier. He analyzed them repeatedly, searching for meaning, intent, threat. Sleep continued to deteriorate. Russell's dreams became vivid and disjointed, filled with images that made no narrative sense but left him shaken upon waking. He often woke up with his heart racing, unable to remember what he had dreamed but certain that it mattered. These mornings were the hardest. The line between anxiety and reality blurred, and it took hours for him to feel grounded again. There were moments when Russell considered that his perceptions might be distorted. He questioned whether the tension he felt at work was real or imagined. This self-doubt was not comforting, it was paralyzing. If he could not trust his own reactions, how could he protect himself? The possibility that he was misinterpreting harmless behavior made him hesitate to act, to speak, to seek clarity. Silence once again became his default response. Still, certain interactions lingered longer than others. There were individuals at work whose behavior felt intentionally invasive, subtle comments, dismissive gestures, an undercurrent of hostility masked as humor. Russell noticed patterns where others did not. He observed how these individuals interacted with different people, how boundaries were selectively ignored. These observations unsettled him deeply, but he kept them to himself. He feared being labeled overly sensitive or unstable. As months passed, Russell's internal alarm grew louder. He felt increasingly disconnected from the world around him, as if watching his own life through a layer of glass. Time lost its usual rhythm. Days blurred together. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, constantly scanning for signs of escalation. This vigilance exhausted him, yet he could not stop. Letting his guard down felt dangerous, even if he could not articulate why. There were brief moments of clarity when Russell recognized that something was wrong, not with the world, but within himself. In those moments, he considered reaching out for help. The thought never lasted. He convinced himself that intervention would only complicate things, that exposing his inner turmoil would make him vulnerable in ways he could not control. He chose endurance over uncertainty. By the time subtle conflicts began to surface at work, Russell was already emotionally depleted. He lacked the energy to confront tension or defend himself assertively. When disagreements arose, he responded with restraint, focusing on tasks rather than personalities. This restraint was misinterpreted as indifference. In reality, it was survival. Russell believed that if he kept his head down, the friction would eventually fade. It did not. Instead, the environment around him grew sharper. The sense of being targeted, whether real or perceived, intensified. Russell could feel the balance shifting, though he did not yet understand the implications. His routines began to fracture. He arrived at work earlier or later than usual, left at irregular times, and changed his routes home without conscious planning. These adjustments were instinctive, driven by an unnamed fear. Russell did not know that these changes marked the beginning of the end of his controlled existence. He still believed that stability could be restored, that the pressure would ease if he endured long enough. He did not recognize the warning signs for what they were. The isolation he had relied on for protection was now working against him, cutting him off from any external perspective. Unbeknownst to Russell, the forces shaping his final months were already in motion. The conflicts he avoided, the behaviors he observed in silence, and the boundaries he noticed but did not challenge were converging towards something far more dangerous than discomfort. His life, once defined by routine and restraint, was quietly slipping beyond his control. And soon, that loss of control would no longer be psychological, it would become irreversible. The hostility at work did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through small, deniable moments, gestures that could be explained away, tones that were never openly aggressive, behaviors that stayed just within acceptable limits. Russell noticed them immediately. He always did. Where others saw harmless interaction, he sensed friction. Where others shrugged things off, he catalogued them, storing each detail in the back of his mind. There was one individual in particular whose presence altered the atmosphere around Russell. This person was louder, more intrusive, and carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had a way of inserting himself into spaces where he did not belong, both physically and socially. His behavior toward others was inconsistent, charming one moment, dismissive the next. Russell observed this pattern closely. It unsettled him. Unlike Russell, this individual thrived on attention. He dominated conversations, disrupted routines, and treated professional boundaries as flexible suggestions rather than rules. Management tolerated him longer than they should have, largely because he knew how to perform just well enough to avoid scrutiny. His behavior existed in a gray area, difficult to formally challenge without appearing overly sensitive. Russell avoided him whenever possible. He adjusted his schedule, altered his habits, and limited interactions to the bare minimum. Despite this, friction was unavoidable. The individual seemed to take Russell's silence personally. Where others engaged or reacted, Russell offered nothing. No validation. No resistance. Just distance. This appeared to irritate him. Subtle provocations began to surface. Tasks were questioned unnecessarily. Russell's work was scrutinized more closely than others, not by supervisors, but by this individual. There was an undercurrent of mockery disguised as concern. Russell never responded. He continued working, focusing on precision and consistency. He believed that professionalism would protect him. It did not. The workplace became increasingly uncomfortable. Russell felt the tension the moment he entered the building. His body reacted before his mind could rationalize it. Shoulders tightened. Breathing became shallow. He found himself constantly aware of where this person was, tracking movement through peripheral vision, listening for footsteps. This hypervigilance drained him, but he could not switch it off. Others noticed the tension but chose not to intervene. Discomfort, when it does not directly affect someone, is easy to ignore. Russell became isolated not just emotionally, but socially. He was excluded from conversations, left out of informal exchanges, and treated as an outsider. This exclusion amplified the imbalance of power. Russell had no allies, no buffer. Despite everything, Russell remained focused on his work. He did not complain. He did not escalate. He told himself that engaging would only make things worse. He believed that endurance was safer than confrontation. This belief had shaped his entire life. It had also left him vulnerable. The individual, however, escalated. Boundaries were pushed further. The provocations became more pointed, though still carefully constructed to remain deniable. Russell sensed intent behind the behavior. It was no longer random. It was targeted. And that realization disturbed him deeply. Russell began documenting small details mentally. Dates. Times. Behaviors. He did not write anything down. He feared that making it tangible would force him to act. Action required exposure. Exposure required vulnerability. He was not ready for that. What Russell did not realize was that his silence was being interpreted not as neutrality, but as defiance. In the absence of reaction, the other man projected intent where there was none. The tension between them was asymmetrical, one driven by control, the other by avoidance. This imbalance would prove critical. By the time Russell fully understood that the situation was no longer manageable, the damage had already been done. The workplace was no longer just a source of stress. It had become a pressure chamber. And pressure, when left unchecked, does not dissipate. It explodes. After the dismissal, Russell expected relief. He expected the pressure at work to dissipate, for the atmosphere to return to something manageable. Instead, the tension followed him beyond the building. It lingered in his routines, embedded itself in his movements, and sharpened his awareness of the world around him. The problem had not been removed. It had simply changed form. The man who had been fired did not disappear. His absence at work only made his presence elsewhere feel heavier. Russell began to notice patterns he had never consciously tracked before. The same figure appearing at familiar distances. The same sensation of being observed without proof. He told himself it was coincidence. He had always been prone to overanalyzing. Still, the unease refused to fade. Russell adjusted his behavior subtly. He left work at different times. He avoided public transportation when possible. He took longer routes home, then shorter ones, then unfamiliar streets altogether. These changes were instinctive, not strategic. His body reacted before his thoughts could organize themselves. Each deviation brought temporary relief, followed by renewed anxiety. There were no direct confrontations. No messages. No visible threats. That absence was more disturbing than overt aggression would have been. Russell understood escalation, even if he avoided it. What unsettled him was the silence. Silence left room for imagination, and his imagination was never kind. At night, Russell replayed the final moments of the termination in his mind. The man's expression. The stillness. The lack of visible reaction. He recognized that look. It was not shock. It was containment. Something held back. Russell understood, too late, that he had become more than a coworker in that man's narrative. He had become a reason. The city no longer felt neutral. Streets felt narrower. Corners felt sharper. Russell became acutely aware of blind spots. Places where cameras did not reach, where lighting failed, where sound did not carry. These observations were not paranoid fantasies. They were practical assessments. Russell had always been observant. Now that trait worked against him. He considered reporting his concerns. The thought passed quickly. He had no evidence, no concrete incident, nothing that could be articulated without sounding unstable. He had spent his life avoiding being perceived that way. He was not about to start now. Instead, he internalized the threat and continued forward, hoping momentum itself would protect him. The man who had been fired, meanwhile, was unraveling. Losing his job had stripped him of structure, authority, and identity. The dismissal was not interpreted as accountability, but humiliation. In his mind, the blame did not rest with his actions, nor with management. It rested with Russell. Russell had been the catalyst. Russell had been the witness. Obsession replaced routine. Resentment hardened into purpose. The more distance Russell tried to create, the more inevitable the convergence became. Two trajectories, once loosely connected by a workplace, were now narrowing toward a single point. Russell sensed it, though he could not articulate how. The feeling was no longer abstract. It was physical. His heart rate increased without cause. His attention fractured. He felt as if time itself was compressing, pushing him toward an endpoint he could not yet see. He still believed he could outlast it. He believed that if he remained cautious, if he avoided provocation, if he kept moving, the threat would dissolve. Russell had always believed endurance was enough. It never was. And as the days shortened and the evenings grew darker, the distance between fear and reality began to collapse. Russell left work later than usual that evening. There was no specific reason, no conscious decision behind it. The sky was already dark, the streets thinning as people retreated indoors. He chose a route he rarely used, cutting through a quieter section of the city where storefronts closed early and streetlights failed in irregular intervals. It felt safer. Less crowded meant fewer variables. That assumption would cost him his life. The ambush happened quickly. There was no warning, no confrontation, no chance to reassess. One moment Russell was walking, focused on the rhythm of his steps, and the next he was forced off balance. The first strike came from behind, precise and committed. Pain registered a fraction of a second after impact, sharp and disorienting. Russell tried to turn. He never saw the face clearly. The second and third wounds followed in rapid succession. The attack was controlled, deliberate, and practiced. There was no hesitation. No wasted movement. The blade entered and withdrew with purpose. Russell collapsed against the pavement, his body reacting before his mind could fully comprehend what was happening. The fourth wound landed as he tried to shield himself. The fifth ended the attempt entirely. The street remained empty. No screams. No witnesses close enough to intervene. The attacker stepped back only when it was finished. There was no frenzy, no excess violence beyond what was required. The body was left where it fell. The man who had waited for this moment turned and disappeared into the darkness without urgency. Russell Gibson died on the cold pavement of an anonymous street, surrounded by buildings that did not notice and lights that did not illuminate enough. His phone lay a short distance away, silent. His routine ended abruptly, without resolution or explanation. By the time someone noticed the body, the attacker was already gone. What remained was uncertainty. No weapon was recovered. No immediate suspects were identified. The cameras in the area provided gaps instead of answers. The attack was clean, fast, and intentional. This was not random violence. It was targeted. Russell's death did not clarify anything. It multiplied the questions. The investigation began without clarity. Russell Gibson's death was immediately classified as a targeted homicide, but beyond that, little was certain. The crime scene offered minimal evidence. No weapon was recovered. There were no usable fingerprints. Surveillance coverage in the area was fragmented, leaving critical gaps in the timeline. Police reconstructed Russell's final movements through indirect data. Phone records confirmed limited activity in the hours before his death. Location tracking showed deviations from his usual route, suggesting a conscious or instinctive attempt to avoid something. No emergency calls were made. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the attack itself. Attention quickly shifted to Russell's personal and professional life. Investigators identified 6 individuals with potential motives. Each connection was examined systematically. Former co-workers, acquaintances, and recent points of conflict were brought in for questioning. Most offered little beyond surface-level familiarity. Russell, it became clear, had lived a contained life. One suspect stood out early. A former co-worker recently dismissed for misconduct. The connection was direct and recent. The timing aligned. His dismissal had been abrupt, and his resentment toward Russell was documented indirectly through internal reports. However, suspicion alone was not sufficient. Interviews revealed inconsistencies. The suspect's account of his movements on the night of the murder shifted between statements. He claimed to have been elsewhere, but could not fully support the claim. His demeanor was controlled, but strained. Investigators noted fixation when Russell's name was mentioned. It was subtle, but consistent. Other suspects were gradually eliminated. Alibis held. Motives weakened under scrutiny. What initially appeared as a broad field of possibilities narrowed steadily. Surveillance footage from nearby streets, though incomplete, placed the former co-worker in the vicinity around the estimated time of death. The footage did not capture the act itself, but it confirmed presence. Digital evidence filled in additional gaps. Phone data showed the suspect's device moving in patterns inconsistent with his statements. Deletions and gaps in activity raised further concern. Combined, these elements began to form a cohesive picture. The investigation shifted focus. Russell's death, once clouded by uncertainty, now pointed toward a single individual. The challenge was no longer identifying the suspect, but proving intent and opportunity beyond reasonable doubt. And the evidence, slowly but decisively, was beginning to align. The arrest did not happen suddenly. It followed days of quiet confirmation. Investigators continued tightening the timeline, comparing surveillance gaps with digital movement data. What initially looked incomplete began to align. The former coworker's movements matched the window of the attack too closely to ignore. His route intersected with Russell's final location in a way that could no longer be explained as coincidence. Additional footage surfaced from a private security camera several blocks away. The angle was poor, the image grainy, but the figure was identifiable. Clothing matched what the suspect had been seen wearing earlier that evening. The direction of travel placed him moving away from the crime scene minutes after the estimated time of death. There was no reason for him to be there. Phone analysis confirmed deliberate behavior. Location data showed the device being powered down shortly after leaving the area, then reactivated later in a different part of the city. Messages and call logs had been selectively deleted. This was not panic. It was intent. When police brought him in again, the tone changed. The questioning was shorter. More focused. The inconsistencies in his earlier statements were presented in sequence. The timeline was laid out without interpretation, allowing the weight of the evidence to speak for itself. His composure fractured. The fixation returned, stronger this time. Russell's name surfaced repeatedly. The arrest was made that night. A search of his residence did not recover the weapon, but it did uncover items that placed him near the scene: clothing, footwear, and trace evidence consistent with the environment where Russell had been killed. Combined with the digital trail and surveillance data, it was enough. He was charged with murder. The trial that followed was brief. The defense argued circumstantial interpretation, but the accumulation of evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of behavior, the motive established by dismissal, the threats implied rather than spoken, and the methodical nature of the attack all pointed in one direction. The jury did not deliberate long. He was convicted and sentenced to prison. Russell Gibson's name faded quickly from public attention. There were no memorials, no widespread outrage. Just a closed case and a finalized report. Another file archived. Another life reduced to documentation. But the investigation left behind a quieter conclusion. Russell had not been randomly targeted. He had not been in the wrong place by chance. His death was the endpoint of a chain that had formed long before the street, the knife, or the night. A chain built from silence, isolation, and a conflict that was never confronted until it was irreversible. And by the time it was understood, it was already over. Russell Gibson's case is officially closed. The suspect was convicted, the evidence documented, the file archived. But none of that explains why no one noticed what was happening until it was too late. Because this was not a murder that began in a dark street. It began much earlier, in plain sight, and in silence.